Welcome to CG Seminar Webinar 280. I'm Carl Homoff from Lingnan University in Hong Kong. And today we will be hearing from 4 speakers for launching a new book today. So the new book is Changing Higher Education in East Asia, edited by Professor Simon Marginson and Dr. Xin Xu. And this book brings together experts from Australia, China mainland, Hong Kong SAR, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and UK, and Vietnam. And their chapters add new strands to the academic conversation about higher education in East Asia. So later on, the editors will introduce you the book, and also one of the chapters co-authored by 2 speakers will share with you about their book chapter. So this, before I hand over to the speaker today, there are some brief housekeeping points I want to highlight here. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted online on the CG website tomorrow morning. A transcript of the chat function conversation will also be posted. And please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when asking a question in order to facilitate face-to-face, a communication via the Zoom. And we recommend using the speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. And whenever you are trying to ask a question, use the chat function and write out the question you wish to ask. At the end of the presentation, if your question is selected, you will be invited to ask it yourself directly. So when invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. Okay, now I would like to invite our presenter, the book editor, Professor Simon Marginson and Xin Xu, to introduce you about this interesting and exciting volume, Changing Higher Education in East Asia. Simon, is your floor.
And I think Xin will open, so.
Thank you. And I've just shared the screen and I hope it's showing on the screen correctly. Thank you. So thank you, Professor Mock, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We are really delighted to present this book to you. And Simon and I will discuss the issues on higher education in East Asia first and provide a brief overview of the book. So to start with, we have a few questions for you. Where is East Asia? And who do you think are included in East Asia? And is East Asia a region? And what defines it as a region? So these questions may look quite simple, but different people may have different answers. And one example is shown on the map here, which does not completely correspond to our understanding of East Asia as a region. So in the opening chapter, we propose that East Asia is not only a geographical zone, but also an important and dynamic cultural and geopolitical zone, influenced largely by the Sinic civilization. And unlike some other world regions like Europe, the regionalization in higher education in East Asia happened largely with bottom-up exchanges rather than with top-down political frameworks. And we understand East Asian higher education systems as including mainland China or China thereafter, and Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and this can also be extended to include Vietnam, Mongolia, and Singapore, where the educational and cultural tradition share similarities with others. We acknowledge that East Asia is very much diversified and there are differences within each system, but there are some commonly shared features unique to the region, which can be termed as the post-Confucian model. And the post-Confucian model includes, for instance, the focused state policies for education development, research investment, and internationalization, and also deep and universal Confucian aspiration for education and the related family commitment to education, and also a shared perception of higher education's contributions to both individual cultivation and the public good. So at this point, I'll pass on to Simon, who will further explain the shared characteristics and main features of East Asian higher education.
Thank you, Xin. Now, the first post-Confucian development in higher education and science was in Japan. In a sense, it was anticipated by the remarkable developments in Japan in the Meiji Restoration period in the 19th century, a period of extraordinary accelerated development in many spheres. But we see this in higher education and science, particularly after World War II. And between the 1950s and the 1990s, Japan built a highly successful, strong, innovative university system and science system. Later, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore followed. And China's takeoff was planned by Deng Xiaoping in the early 1980s, when university autonomy was re-established after the Cultural Revolution. Foreign scientists began to visit, and Chinese students started to go abroad. But the great growth of enrollments and research in China dates from about the mid-1990s. And amazingly, China has moved from a gross tertiary enrollment ratio of 4.4% in 1995 to 58.4% in 2020, only 25 years later, from 4% to 58%. Now, East Asian secondary school students are the strongest in the world in the OECD's PISA comparison of student achievement in maths, science, and reading at age 15, which provides a good platform for an expanding tertiary system structure. In China, Singapore, and Taiwan, enrollments are public sector dominated. There is a private sector, but it's a secondary sector in terms of enrollment. In Japan and South Korea, the private sector is larger, but it's closely regulated by the state. However, in all the massifying East Asian systems, as in other parts of the world, growth is associated with issues around quality, equity, and graduate employability. Growth in science papers is correlated to the growth of funding for research in higher education in constant price terms, as is shown here by the graph for China. China is now the world's largest producer of English language science, with 47% more papers than in the US in 2020. Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, Hong Kong, SAR, all have robust science and social science humanities systems. Vietnam has the world's second fastest rate of growth in science papers. Now, in research funding, governments, with a partial exception of Hong Kong, I think, give top priority to physical sciences STEM. In high citation science in those disciplines, Tsinghua, Zhejiang, Harbin, and others in China, and also Nanyang and NUS in Singapore, are now on par with MIT, Harvard, Stanford, and Berkeley. Now, what are the disciplines in which endogenous factors are epistemically more important, where the local and national and perhaps regional lenses and agendas are key, such as, say, public health or social sciences and humanities? Well, there the situation is different. In those disciplines, much of the work is in national languages, so global comparisons of English language output are not relevant. However, East Asian scholars in the HAS disciplines, humanities and social science disciplines, feel that their fields lack resources and status by comparison with the physical sciences. In disciplines where Euro-America is not the benchmark, East Asian higher education seems less strong. One effect of this is to prolong the global dominance of what is a primarily still American monoculture at the global level in the humanities and social sciences. And despite the aggregate strength of science in East Asia, East-West collaborations are more compelling than collaborations within the region, although China is a major partner with all the other countries. And in Singapore, it's the larger partner than the US. East-West student mobility flows are asymmetrical. They embody arguably post-colonial Eurocentric imaginaries and the lure of global whiteness, as Riyad Shah Jahan and Kirsten Edwards have told us. Large numbers of students leave strong East Asian systems for the West, but few Westerners move in the opposite direction into those same strong East Asian systems. However, there are growing mobility flows within East Asia. despite disruption during the pandemic. I'll now pass back to Xin, who will expand on how East Asia looks at itself through the double lenses of West and East.
Thank you, Simon. So to better understand East Asia, we also need to talk about the West, although we note that East-West relationship is not everything, and we'll come back to this point later. And here, the West broadly refers to the Anglo-European systems, though it also includes countries such as Australia and New Zealand, which share the Occidental cultures. We use the simplified terms like the West and the East for some level of generalization, but we also acknowledge the limitations of these terms. And so the East and the West, broadly speaking, the West has been very influential to the East. So there are generally dual perceptions of the West. The West is seen both as a friend and as a foe. On the one hand, the West is seen as a reference point for catching up, equivalent to international, a teacher and leader to learn from, a symbol of modernization, a model of democracy, and also potential political and military ally for some East Asian countries. But at the same time, the West is also seen by the East as a conqueror, colonizer, competitor, oppressor, and exploiter who should be cautioned against. This dual perception is rooted in the continuing colonial imaginary, the Western and white supremacy, and also Western dominance in the world and in global higher education. And the seemingly paradoxical perceptions create tensions in East Asian higher education between internationalization, Westernization, and indigenization. On the one hand, the continuing Western supremacy and imprints are entrenched in higher education and research in East Asia. For instance, national world-class university schemes largely follow Western models, international partnership and branch campuses are largely developed with Western universities, and the asymmetrical academic mobility and research collaboration patterns Simon just discussed, as well as the strong emphasis on English language in teaching and publications in East Asian universities. And consequently, although East Asia is rising, it is rising in the Western framework as judged by Western criteria. The cultures, epistemologies, discourses, methodologies, evaluative criteria still bear Western influence, and internationalization sometimes can easily become a synonym of Westernization. And the unbalanced relations could also create epistemic injustice in academic research in East Asia, of East Asia, and with East Asia. However, on the other hand, the East and the West will never be the same. This is due to the fundamental Eastern-Western cultural differences and the resilience of the indigenous cultures that still nourish contemporary higher education in East Asia. For instance, governments, universities, academics, and students have been emphasizing on local agency and pushing back against potential Westernization, and also pay attention to emphasizing on the local agenda, knowledge, and language. And de-Westernization also happens in scholarships about the region, where it is not only appropriated to Western frameworks, but can also use inter-referencing approaches to compare systems within the region. And against this changing and dynamic background, we present this new book, Changing Higher Education in East Asia. The book contains 12 chapters, organized in 3 parts. In general, we think the chapters demonstrate 和而不同 idea of harmony without uniformity, as they share commonality and complementarity across each other and also across the East and the West. This would not have been possible if without this group of stellar contributors we've had huge privileges of working with. And all the contributors, we believe, have the expertise and capability to research both Eastern and Western higher education and treat both cultures as equal and contribute to building meaningful dialogues across them. So now you may be curious about the chapters already, but before moving into the chapters, there's one thing to mention. To open each part of the book, we have chosen one word that foregrounds the theme of that part. The three words all exist in written languages of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese. And the three words embody important philosophical traditions and ontological understandings from East Asia about relationships, about the world, and about humanity. And the similarities and differences in their meanings and pronunciations also reflect the cultural homogeneity and heterogeneity in East Asia. We thank Li Chuan, So-Young Lee, and Ikuya Azawa for helping us checking the meaning in different languages. And now, moving to the chapters. Due to the time limitation, we'll do a brief overview for each chapter today. But we have another upcoming book symposium at the Higher Education Research Association Conference on April 28th, where you'll be hearing from all authors about their chapters. You're very much welcome to join us then. And we've put the link of the program, which was just released today, on the final slide. So in chapter 1, we discussed in much more details about East Asian higher education and about the book. The title is based on a quote from an essay by the Chinese philosopher Feng Youlan, and the quote is 八音合奏，中和且平, which is loosely translated by us as the ensemble of diverse music brings peace and harmony. And this reflects our understanding of East Asian higher education and also our perception of this book. And part 1 locates largely Western origin discourses of the global public good and global citizenship education in the East Asian higher education context. Chapter 2 is by Olga and Yunkyung. They have worked with interviews in South Korea, apply the endogenous lens of Chong to explore the global public role of higher education. And they will present their chapter in fuller details later. And in chapter 3, Lingnan proposes the Chinese idea 天下为公 as an arguably richer approach to understanding global public good and global common good in general and in higher education. Chapter 3 also discusses the implications of 天下为公 in higher education practices. And in chapter 4, Aja Habibi reviews the literature on global and world citizenship education in both Chinese and English languages, with a special focus on the articulation in Chinese higher education. And chapter 5 by Lin Tian and Nian Cailiu reports on the 74 interviews conducted in China, Western Europe, and in the United States. They discuss the education, research, and service functions of world-class universities, enabling a regional comparison of how they understand their contributions to the global common good. And the second part of the book is on the internationalization and indigenization, regionalization and globalization. Chapter 6 is by Chris Hammond. The chapter draws on 67 interviews in Japan and examines the current state and possible futures of regional cooperation in Northeast Asian higher education, with a focus on the government-initiated programs in student mobility and science.
In chapter 7, Xin Xu explores the dynamics of internationalization in the humanities and social sciences in China, while also exploring agency and structure in the Chinese context. Xin draws on national and institutional policy documents, interviews with humanities and social science academics, university leaders, and editors in China. Chapter 8 is by Julie Chia Lin, and it focuses on Taiwan at the intersection of internationalization, national identity, and institutional strategy. Julie interviews the administrator managers of international affairs in 5 Taiwanese universities. Chapter 9 is on the geopolitics and internationalization of higher education in Vietnam. Li Tran, Huang Litan Fan, and Hyun Bui review the changing drivers of internationalization, from politically shaped mobility to economic integration into the global economy, and fostering quality in Vietnam's education system. Nope. We are. Part 3, back on track. Part 3 is about international mobility and academic migration. Tom Brotherhood in chapter 10 focuses on student and graduate migration into Japan, using participant narratives to explore trajectories of individual agency. You may not have imagined Japan as a destination for skilled labour migration, but with democratic decline, it has become a quiet but important theme in Japanese policy, and there are opportunities for international student graduates which didn't previously exist in Japan. In chapter 11, Futua Huang, who is himself an academic migrant into Japan, uses surveys and interviews to investigate international faculty hired in China's universities, their basic characteristics, their motivation to work in China, and their roles in Chinese universities. And the final chapter 12 is by the chair of today's webinar, Kaho Mok, who looks at the impact of the pandemic on international student mobility, drawing on Lingnan University's surveys of prospective mobile students in China. Are students shifting their plans from the journey to the West to mobility inside East Asia? That's an important question, but I'm not going to tell you the answer. You'll have to obtain the book and read Kaho's chapter to find out. Xin.
So now moving on to some of the questions for the futures of higher education in East Asia. This book does not exhaust all the issues relevant to higher education in East Asia, and some of the possible questions to consider for the future include, for instance, what will be defining East Asia as a region in future higher education, and who will be defining that? And what will happen to the regionalization of East Asia higher education, considering the geopolitical tensions, as well as wider networks such as the Belt and Road Initiative and the relationship with ASEAN? And what role will East Asia play in global higher education and research? And what contributions can East Asian higher education make to our future? And how will studies on East Asian higher education evolve in the local, national, and global contexts? Some of the questions were touched upon in the book, while some remain open for further exploration and discussion. If you're interested, we would very much love to invite you to read the book, to reflect and research further about East Asian higher education, and to share your thoughts and works with the community. And finally, thank you all again for joining us today, and a huge thank you to all colleagues who have contributed to or supported this book. It has been a wonderful intellectual journey for us, and we very much hope that in studies on East Asian higher education, more cross-cultural bridges can emerge and more mutually enriching dialogues can flourish. And on this note, we're delighted to hand over to Olga and Yunkyung. They will guide us through their fascinating cross-cultural dialogues on Zhang and the global public good.
Thank you, Simon and Xin, for a wonderful introduction about the background, the major contents, the key issues being discussed in this new book. Now, may I call upon Olga and Yunkyung to discuss an interesting chapter as part of the book, Global Public Good in Korea as Zhang. Now, Olga, it's your floor.
Thank you so much. I will just share the screen with our presentation. Please let us know if you can see the screen in the slideshow. So if all is good, I will start. So the title of our chapter is The Global Public Good in Korea as Zhang, and I'm delighted to present it today with my colleague, Dr. Yunkyung. And on the first slide, we intentionally included a photo from our fieldwork, and you can see our silent companions, Buhansan Mountain and Han River. So the goal of our chapter was to understand how we can conceptualize and interpret the public good discussion in higher education in South Korea through non-Western epistemology of Zhang. We hope this chapter is a theoretical and methodological contribution to decenter Western epistemologies that are prevalent in higher education research at present. We ground our analysis based on interviews with policymakers and academics, and we propose a new epistemological lens of Zhang as a conceptual tool and methodology in higher education research. Dr. Min will now share a bit more on what we mean by Zhang. And also she will elaborate on the context of the study.
Good afternoon. My name is Yunkyung. It is my pleasure to have an opportunity to present a book chapter with the Olga. Before jumping into my presentation, what I would like to say that I'm from South Korea, and here is 9 hours difference from UK. It means that it is over 11 p.m. So if I make any mistake, that's because I feel sleepy. Please understand me whenever I make any mistake. Originally, I was not going to be involved in this project. I was only supposed to guide Olga Moon, who visited Korea to do interviews for the project. As I look back on that time, how I get involved in this work, I think it is related to Zhang, which is a main theme of our book chapter. And Olga actually wrote about it in the chapter. That's why this chapter means a lot to me. In the past 4 decades, Korea's higher education has experienced a dramatic increase in participation. The rate of college matriculation grew from about 27% in 1980 to 70% in 2019, making Korea the first ranked country in terms of student enrollment among the OECD countries for the past 10 years. The growth might be partially attributed to the strong value of education by individuals and the society, and possibly by the flourishing of private universities. As of 2019, out of the total 191 universities, 156 are private and 35 are public. Not only the majority of the universities are private, about 62% of higher education funding comes from private sector investments. Despite most of the financing coming from private sources, the Korean government takes an active role in shaping the higher education policy for all universities in the sphere of autonomy, tuition fees, student recruitment, and internationalization. All universities are required to follow strict government standards and policies in order to retain state funding. Meanwhile, like many higher education institutions around the world, Korean universities are also facing commercialization and marketization pressures. While commercialization of higher education is embraced by some academics and policymakers as inevitable, there is no consensus on the role of the market in higher education. Furthermore, not many studies exist on the perception of the role in public good of higher education. That's why Olga and I did this research and analyzed it based on the concept of Zhang. And what is Zhang? Zhang is not unique to South Korea, and it is present in other East Asian contexts. But the working definition of Zhang here is grounded in South Korean culture. The concept of Zhang is similar to that of affection and attachment, but rather than including strong feelings such as love, it is a more passive form of emotional bonding. To be more specific, Zhang is a type of emotion. It arises from nurturing human relationships through understanding, inclusion, and assistance, and it lasts for a long period of time. There are 5 key Zhang characteristics in more detail. First, it is a relationship. Zhang is a fundamental and important means of establishing a relationship in Korean culture. Many Koreans maintain their relationship with others by putting the other person in the category of we, in which I and you exist as an inseparable unit. In Korea, it is considered that Zhang makes human relations more humane. From this perspective, the sociality of Koreans based on Zhang can be contrasted with the human relations of Western society based on individualism. Second, it is persistent. It is formed over a long period of time through the act of worrying, caring, and helping another person and considering the other person's position. Third, the value of authenticity of the other person's intentions, sincerity, and reciprocity are important. The Korean proverb says there must be a give and take in Zhang. In English, scratch my back and I will scratch yours. Fourth, it is a sense of bonding and a sense of community witness. In Korea, people who understand and help others are viewed as humane and compassionate, while those who do not are thought of as cold and heartless. Zhang culture creates a sense of community that is witness, and Koreans value witness. The final fifth characteristic is ambivalence. Zhang is not necessarily always a positive feeling, nor does it always happen reciprocally. People who feel that they are close to another will have Zhang, even if those feelings are not reciprocated. Like this, the concept of Zhang is very complicated and difficult, but at the same time, it is a very good concept to represent Korean culture. We thought that the intertwined nature of Zhang can also be found in higher education, so we used Zhang to analyze the role of public good in Korean higher education. This is my presentation. Afterwards, Olga make a presentation on the characteristics of the public good of higher education in Korea based on Zhang.
Thank you, Yunkyung. So we have identified 4 characteristics of Zhang in Korean higher education. We recognize that this concept is not very well theorized in the context of higher education research in Korea. So we allowed ourselves to develop these categories based on the interview information and based on our analysis of academic literature in Korean language and in English languages. So the first category we propose is Zhang as humanistic pedagogy, Zhang as community development, Zhang as the culture of togetherness and oneness, and we also think that we can think with Zhang about beyond human pedagogy in higher education. So the first characteristics of Zhang as a humanistic pedagogy focuses on professor-student and student-student relationships. So for example, if we think maybe in Western universities or in North American universities, student experience is seen through the lenses of individual students' experience. We propose that in South Korean context, this experience is pretty much collective. So students are expected to travel with professors together in the first year of research. There are a lot of rituals that are institutionalized within higher education that encourage eating together and spending time together, also by volunteering together at various summer and winter camps and through outreach programs. So for example, what can be sometimes seen as an additional service in Western higher education, we think that in South Korean higher education was seen as central. So for example, the outreach programs were conceptualized by our interviewees as central to their career as an academic. So they would talk not only about research, but primarily about their engagement with students through teaching. And that's why we also think Zhang as a humanistic pedagogy focuses on the teaching aspect of the higher education's role in global public good and not necessarily the research aspect. So for example, if in some, let's say, UK context, universities are being measured on their research performance indicators as contribution to the public good, many of our interviewees, in fact, focused on the human aspect of Zhang. And they highlighted organizing summer schools on difficult topics. So for example, Japanese-South Korean history and relations as very important to them, because they thought that they could contribute to peace discussions by engaging primarily with students. And many academics do it sometimes on an unpaid basis as a public service, and they still see it as essential for their career. So this was in brief about the first category of Zhang as a humanistic pedagogy. The second category is the Zhang as community development and a culture of helping and sharing. So South Korea has transitioned from a donor-receiving country to an aid-giving country. So there was this strong understanding among the interviewees that it is now Korea's turn to help communities around the world and to help communities in East Asia specifically. So many of the interviewees mentioned that there are a lot of projects with students from Mongolia, Cambodia, that encourage community service. And they see community service projects, for example, in rural areas that are led by students and professors together as, again, essential to the higher education experience. So, for example, it could be postgraduate students or undergraduate students that would go together and spend summers volunteering, and that would be seen as a central experience to them. Of course, in addition to academic engagement, however, they would say that the community spirit and engaging for a long time, continuously and over the years, is one of the crucial parts of being a student and an academic in Korean higher education. So we also think that this experience on orientedness and community beyond borders is significant. So we think that this lens could help us understand that the community service in higher education is beyond the national. So it focuses on the regional and on the global communities. So many of the interviewers actually highlighted that many of the projects are international, and they were quite proud of that. So many student mobility programs are being developed and joint research initiatives and international development programs. So we think that Zhang has the opportunities for us to reimagine higher education and blur the borders and boundaries of what falls into a higher education community beyond the national borders. So the third category of Zhang is promoting and stands for the culture of togetherness and oneness. And an example of that I'll be just providing today, and not to worry, this picture is this generic picture of Seoul. It's not a picture of our research site, but we are talking about the example of public roof garden on the university building in South Korea. So this rooftop garden, first of all, it was open access. So local residents, any students and alumni with children could enter this space, plant and grow vegetables together. So unlike, for example, many urban campuses around the world that are gated, that are behind closed doors, this space was in fact welcoming. And it was open to everyone, not only those who belong to the university community. So we think, and participants thought it was a very good example of the public role of higher education, because it facilitated intergenerational learning. An intergenerational aspect of higher education was also seen quite as an important category by our participants, some of whom have explicitly said that the role of higher education is to facilitate intergenerational dialogues. And we think it's also quite important because sometimes the image of a student in some literature or in some approaches of how students are being recruited, it could be one-sided, focusing on a particular age category of students. But in this case, in Korea, it was seen that the higher educations, they're more publicly oriented institutions that will promote this culture of togetherness and oneness. And the final example of Zhang as the beyond human pedagogy, we titled it Nature Human Nexus in Higher Education. There was a case study, a case in our research that focused on the role of campuses and urban campuses in facilitating respect to nature, flora, and fauna. So one field site particularly had a building that was completely relying on rainwater to maintain the essential sewage systems. This rainwater was a sustainable resource. So it was not seen as a project just to meet the tick boxes for the sustainability agenda, but rather the whole project was envisioned to be sustainable completely, both environmentally, from a civic engineering point of view, and also socially, because the water was so clean that even if it was used to maintain the essential sewage systems, it was still then of good quality to be used for watering plants around the campus. So this example of maintaining spaces that are completely sustainable socially, economically, we thought is a beautiful case of how university spaces can be not close-minded and behind walls, but rather completely in sync with the environment. And also another case contained a rooftop garden with specific places for bees and for students to meet each other. And one of the interviewees highlighted that he thinks of the role of higher education, not only produce efficient members of the economy or the labor market, but he said that universities and higher education spaces are the spaces to smile together. And he really wanted us to think about smiling together, enjoying growing vegetables, enjoying the companies of bees. And it was all was happening at the backdrop of beautiful mountains and a very hot sun in Seoul during the field work. So this is the conclusion of our presentation. We tried to look at the public good role of higher education through a Korean concept of Zhang by introducing 4 ways to conceptualize it. And we hope that there might be some uptake of our research, especially in the light of geopolitical events in the world, where sometimes, for example, asylum seekers are expected to pay international student fees, and there's a lot of borders in higher education and commercialization. But with the help of Zhang, we hope we can move the conversation forward. And we indeed agree with Professor Mignola that the multiplication of options rather than the elimination of them is the road to global futures. So we hope our project contributes to epistemically pluriversalizing our knowledge on what is global public good in higher education and what theories and concepts and methodologies can we embrace as researchers in the field of higher education to develop sustainable and respectful collaborations. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga and Yunkyung, for a very interesting sharing and discussion about how Asian university could be conceptualized through a very traditional concept of Zhang, particularly in the case of Korea. And I particularly like your conclusion because you remind us about the importance about sustainable development and also sustainable collaboration. And during the last few years, I think the global health crisis should have humbled many people, world leaders and also academic leaders. So in what way we can collaborate together to understand cultures and try to understand and accept differences and embrace diversity through our different cultural orientation would be very important. Now, thank you very much for the 4 speakers for not only introducing the book, but also sharing one of the book chapter with us. Now, I think the floor is now open. So I see at least in the chat room, there are 2 questions being raised. So Glenn, can I invite you to turn on your video and ask the question? Yeah, thank you, Glenn.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed this panel presentation and particularly interacting with Professor Simon again after quite a while, I would say. It seems to me that what I what I gleaned from your the essence of your book is really that East Asian education in your focus has gained from transmigratory cultures, okay, which is to say that there have been the East Asian cultures that fed in and of themselves within the system into educational patterns. And then subsequently, the West coming in and interacting either for either colonial or, humanistic interactions. I'd like to know, as of this present time, COVID and all factors being considered, what would be, the present East Asian education growth in both the modern sciences and in the emergent sciences, and I would say on a quid pro quo basis. Thank you.
Simon, please.
Glenn, I'm not quite sure what you're asking us, but are you asking us about the influence of higher education and knowledge outside East Asia in East Asia? Or are you talking about East Asia's larger role in the world?
I would, sorry. I would say this, that given particularly from the last presentation that we paid attention to, Zhang, for example, what would that contribute, that as a concept to Western higher education, even as Western higher education has influenced the very language in which you presented that concept.
Understand.
Okay.
Yeah, good. That's a good question. And it's your question is posed by what Xin said about East-West flows and influences and ways of seeing, and also the Zhang concept itself. I mean, I think that there's a great asymmetry between the way in which we're going to use these crude approximations, East and West, relate to each other in this regard. In the West, there's three attitudes to East Asia. And I include higher education in East Asia and Western higher education in this comment. The first attitude is there's clearly something happening in this other part of the world, but I don't know about it and I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to go on living my life as before. I'm not going to be influenced at all by what's happening in East Asia, by the growth of the modern East Asian higher education and knowledge systems. I'm just going to go on living my life as before. And I think this is the dominant attitude. Overwhelmingly, most people have this attitude. The second attitude, which is quite common, is that we should relate to East Asia from the West. We should form collaborations and cooperate with institutions and scholars and students in the East. But we should relate in relation to the things which we know and value, so that Westerners look to those things in East Asia that they already know and understand as part of the West. They give value to those things. Their suggestions or prescriptions in relation to East Asian development is to become more Western, more like us, and to not notice or not want to know about those things which are endogenous, different, distinctive to the East. The third attitude, which is, I think, fairly small group of people, is to say, well, look, East Asia is really interesting and important as a civilizational zone. We have a lot to learn here. There may be things in East Asia which we need to learn from directly. There are other things we might learn to understand in their own context, even though our context is different. But we need to understand, to know, to learn the languages, to exchange culturally, to share the world, to talk about joint and separate activities with our colleagues in East Asia. That, as an attitude, as I said, is a small group of people. But if you think about East Asia and how it sees the West, most people in higher education seem to have that third attitude, a willingness to learn from the West, to connect to the West, not just in East Asian terms, but in Western terms, to try and think in two different cultures, to try and think beyond the box, if you like. So East Asian people have been learning in this broader relational environment for a long time. Westerners are not learning as yet much from East Asia. East Asia is as big, as old, as deep, as accomplished as the West in every respect, including science and technology and industry now, but certainly in terms of culture and language and understanding of human affairs. There's nothing like the Zhang concept in English language thinking, but this is a really good idea. This is notion of long-term affect-based relationships and values. It's something we could do and we all should do a lot more. The whole emphasis on relationality and the ethics of relationships is, in Confucian and related cultures, the emphasis on nature, Taoism, Confucianism, focus on nature and and its relationship with human society. Those things are things which either we don't have never had in the West, or we're perhaps diminished over time. Then they're things we need to embrace. So I think there's a lot to learn there.
Okay, thank you, Simon. We have a few questions. Another one is from Joshua here. Joshua, could you ask your question and open your yeah, Joshua.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. And I think my question comes from the angle of looking beyond East and West collaborations. Sorry, my name is Joshua, I'm from Singapore. And it's great to hear from Mr. Glenn from Thailand. So my question is really about how the growing relationship with ASEAN between East Asian countries has really influenced education in East Asia as well. And I'm looking from the angle from perhaps examples of student migration or development programs like the ADB.
Who would like to take the question then?
You know, I mean, Kaho, I think you know more about ASEAN than the rest of us. I mean, it's an important topic and an interesting one, but our book wasn't about Southeast Asia. We study the region, the Asian region, in our higher education program at Oxford. It's a very interesting region. And, you know, there you have a regional approach to many things now developing. And of course, East Asia conspicuously unable to create a political region in the same sense at this stage. But as you say, you know, ASEAN +3 brings everyone together kind of through the back door. And is that generating regionalism in East Asia? I mean, Chris Hammond's chapter would suggest probably not yet. But, you know, it's really important that China, Korea and Japan and Vietnam too, you know, learn to talk to each other better. So we're hoping that educational cooperation is one of the ways that will come forward. But as yet, that regional level of formal regional collaboration, not strongly established at all, whereas informal links seem to be quite a lot more. And also from East Asia through Korea and Taiwan and Japan, especially into Southeast Asia. You know, there's a lot going on there.
So my recent research funded by the British Council precisely is to examine about UK university partnering with the ASEAN universities, also branching out with the big three, as you just mentioned. There's evidence showing about a stronger relationship in terms of research partnership, in terms of co-authorship, not only between the UK partners with that of the ASEAN, but also the big three, having a heavy involvement in the last 20 years, particularly in co-authorship in terms of international publication. But certainly, based on the current evidence, when comparing to Europe or EU, I agree with Simon that, you know, ASEAN and also the collaboration within the region is emerging. We cannot say this is a very mature regionalization, but this is a possibility, especially under this current COVID-19 pandemic, and more Chinese, Indian students, based upon the recent study, also showing that they may be choosing their overseas learning within the region rather than going to the traditional West. And a recent report also report about the global north has a decline in student number, whereas the global south seem to have the increase in number. That's published by the University of Yale. It could be the reference point, but I think it certainly needs more research to answer your question. So I see two more questions at least. Can I now invite Vedika Keda? There's a question about, yeah, peace.
Hello everyone, I'm Vedika from India, currently a Yunkyung scholar at Peking University. So my question is, as Professor mentioned in the presentation, science publications from universities in East Asia are currently outnumbering those from leading Western universities like the MIT. So my question is, how long do you think it is before universities like Tsinghua actually compete with MIT in overall university rankings and become most preferred destination for international students?
I think that one's for Xin.
Xin?
Thank you, Vedika, for your question. That's a really interesting one and important one. And I'll make a start. And colleagues on this panel, please also feel free to join me. So I think your question, there are at least two layers. The first layer is about the global university rankings and how the strong performance of East Asian universities are showing on the global university rankings. But as mentioned also in our presentation and also in the book, we argue that the global university rankings, and with other scholars as well, the global university rankings mainly recycle the Western criteria of what world-class universities will be looking like. So even if universities ranking high on those rankings, does not necessarily mean they will be like, they will be releasing all the potential, for instance, from their endogenous research or agendas or endogenous cultures. So there's a question mark around the university ranking leadership. And the second question is about the preferred destination for international students, which is again can be entangled with not just the reputation, the ranking, and or the competition factor, which many of the scholars also have critical studies on and perceptions about that. And also it relates to, for instance, how the higher education space in the global space can be quite racialized, as for instance, in the paper by Zhang and colleagues, their argument is that the global whiteness actually influence, for instance, students' preferred destinations in terms of choosing international education destinies, where in this context, East Asian destinies may not be as highly preferred as compared to the white part of the global higher education. So I think your question really helps us to think further and unpack lots of those issues.
Okay, because at the time constraint, that's the last question for this webinar. May I invite Olga or Yunkyung to answer? It's related to the previous question, basically asking about wondering if the new book shows evidence on whether in reality, East Asian higher education is increasingly westernized or able to maintain their distinctiveness from Western model of higher education. Where does East Asian higher education stand and where is it heading? You know, Olga and Yunkyung, in your chapter, you conceptualize about higher education development in East Asia through the traditional concept of Zhang. So would you want to take this question? How East Asian higher education stand would it influence about the Western or being westernized? Peace.
ये ये भी एक बुक निकाल दिया भाई.
Yunkyung, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I have to admit that Korean higher education is being westernized so fast since the implementation of US ranking, and also government to pursue universities to westernize. They want to evaluate based on the Western criteria, I think. So I think whether we are able to maintain our distinctiveness from the Western model is really up to our government. But honestly, I'm very pessimistic about that. But that's why this chapter is really important, because it's a kind of we want to preserve our value, I think. Yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, so I think just to add to that, I think with our chapter, we wanted to highlight that East Asian higher education and Korean higher education is complex, and the way we studied it and whether we see complexity, it also depends on the researchers. And we wanted to highlight that, there are indigenous ways of looking at it. There are alternative practices that exist. They are sustainable and they could provide an alternative. So I think many institutions are hybrid in a way, but I guess we wanted to show that they can be different, and we can somewhat combat the ideas of individualism and hyper-competitiveness and loneliness academia by trying to focus on the collective, as in our interpretation of Zhang.
Okay, thank you very much for the speakers for presenting us a new book with a focus on East Asian higher education. I think this webinar would offer a very good platform for us, no matter where you are from, to rethink about the futures of higher education across different parts of the world. As Simon has rightly pointed out, East Asian higher education has a very rich traditions, very deep and thick, and similar to other parts of the world. But in what way we can have an open mind, talking to each other, having more productive dialogue in order to understand better about the differences and also embrace diversity. I think this is the time for us to collaborate and cooperate. So this webinar has been recorded and will be posted online on the CG website tomorrow. And a transcript of the chat function conversation will also be posted. And colleagues and friends, thank you for joining this webinar, and see you next time, the CG webinar. Be safe, and hopefully in future we can see each other in different occasions to hug each other and say goodbye tonight. Bye-bye.